Afternoon, everyone, or whatever time this gets to you. It's Neil Whitman back to continue the series in which I give you my perspective as an old retired soldier and as a Christian man on how to develop mental resiliency, mindfulness, and understand spirituality in a way that can truly help and change your life for the better. What I want to talk to you about today is a little bit different from my standard fare. I've often talked about some pretty stark life and death things, and this analogy from my military career is a bit of a different one. I'm not going to talk about combat or diplomacy. I'm not going to talk about peacekeeping. I'm going to talk about jargon. And when I say jargon, what I mean is I'm going to talk about the use of vocabulary without understanding what exactly we're saying. It's a very common problem. I was 20 years an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, and we love our jargon, man. Anyone who isn't familiar with the Army, that sits around with a bunch of Army guys, will quickly attest to the fact that we speak in our own language. We have lots of buzzwords, as every industry does. You know, there's the business industry often fiddles with ideas like synergy and synergism and such. One of the favorites I remember is granularity. Well, we need more granularity on this topic. We need more granularity on this operation. Provide me some granularity. And you're like, okay. What exactly do you mean when you use that word? Because it has a meaning. I'm just not sure if you are using it for that, right? Another one is inculcating values. You hear someone say, we need to inculcate Canadian values into the armed forces, or we need to inculcate the values of tolerance and respect for all genders, etc. And that's all fine and good, but when you don't entirely comprehend what inculcate means and entails, because it's a very precise word, what you see someone do with that direction may be very different from what you anticipated. So we're going to talk about a term which is very popular in what I'll call the self-help sphere. And that term is to cultivate integrity, to cultivate mindfulness, or to cultivate spirituality or mental resiliency, etc., etc., etc. And we talk about that a lot. It's a term that I'm sure you've heard used before, and in Christian circles it's often said that we need to cultivate a life of holiness. And that's all fine and good, and it's a very good image of what we're supposed to do. But I think that we often have intellectualized the term to the point that we don't even see what the image is that's being offered to us. So what I'm going to challenge you to do today is to go on a little journey with me to imagine what cultivating actually means by examining the term, as we did with integrity in the first video I did in context of a house. But imagine what cultivate actually means in its original meaning. Because cultivate, when I talk to people about cultivating mindfulness, they often just talk about, well, I'm doing these practices and I'm incorporating this into my life and I'm taking time for meditation and, breathing exercises, etc., etc. It's like, okay, that's all fine and good, but that's not actually cultivation. That's something of just changing your behaviors. Cultivation at its core means to grow things in the earth, right? Do you understand what I mean by that? That to cultivate, as I've just put a couple of gardens in on the other side of the lot here. We're standing at the back of my property right now, looking into some older growth that has grown up wild. But cultivating its end state is to have earth where you can plant fruit trees and vegetables so that they can grow up and produce food for you, right? That's what cultivation is. Now, if you have not cultivated in your life spirituality, if you have not cultivated in your life Christianity, If you've done no cultivation in your life, then what you end up with is this behind me. And can you see that when the ground is not worked, it grows up and there are big trees and there's a lot of undergrowth and a lot of snarly, snagging stuff, and there's even some probably leftover garbage and refuse that's in there. So if this is your life, imagine what happens if you take these spiritual practices and you sow those practices into the forest of your life, that is your heart. Well, obviously, everything that that seed is going to produce will die. It can't grow up in that. It's actually interesting because this idea of cultivating one's life is a very Christian image. It's one that Jesus himself used often to describe the kingdom of God. That he talks about the sower, and he says the sower sows his seeds, and the seeds are, of course, the truth that he's describing, the way in order to know God. And some of those seeds land on the hard earth and the birds eat them. Some land in the rocky soil and they grow up, but the roots are not deep, and so they're scorched by the sun and they die. He says some fall amidst the thorns, and although they shoot up, they die strangled by the thorns. And only some fall in the good soil and are able to root deep and then grow and produce fruit. Well, this is the thorny ground, if you will. If you sow seeds of Christian truth into this earth, it has no way of surviving because the soil's not right. It's probably too acid. Um, there's all kinds of undergrowth that's going to compete with it for any light from the sun. The water is not going to be good because the roots of all the other plants are well established and they're going to suck it up. And at best, you might have a piece of green come up and it will live for the season, produce nothing because it has no strength, and then it will die. So if you can imagine that and kind of apply it, it's a good analogy for the problem. So if you think about Jordan Peterson and his biblical series, he presented to the world, for many people for the first time in a real way, what are the biblical teachings. And he tried to say, we need to incorporate these practices into ourselves to regain what was formerly Western civilization. We need these practices. But there's a fundamental problem with that because the practices themselves are like the seeds of truth, that if you sow them and you don't clear out the land first, they can't possibly grow and produce fruit, right? The fruit of Western civilization was born from people who genuinely believed this stuff, who truly cultivated it in their lives, and then produced a great harvest of fruit that was the end of slavery, that was the beginnings of democracy, and that was the fruits that would produce the Enlightenment from the Reformation, and all of these things that ultimately came forth from people who truly changed their lives in order to plant these seeds in a real way. So imagine that you're going to clear this land and try and plant. What do you got to do? Well, obviously, the first thing you're going to have to do is cut all the junk out of the way at the bottom, which is preventing you from getting around. And you might imagine that that is like the habits of your life, the addictions and the pleasurable habits that you pursue destructively that are keeping you from being able to actually even approach uh, in a positive way any growth in yourself. Now, in doing this, you are basically doing what Jordan Peterson has told you to do, which is to clear your room, to clean your room, to take charge of yourself. That's fine. If you've got that far, maybe you're thinking, now I can start sowing some seeds and they'll grow up. But that can't work anyway, because you still have all these big trees here. Once you've cleaned the room, there's all these big trees, and they're still going to prevent anything from growing under them, because they steal the light and they steal all the goodness out of the soil. So if you imagine the big trees as anything, I would suggest to you that they are the philosophies that you have allowed to grow up in yourselves, which are like secular materialism, which are like scientism, as opposed to true application of the scientific method. Okay? But the worship of science as the only form of truth, as opposed to understanding it as a form of truth along with many others. If you've incorporated into your ideology that religion is all the same, and this tree is standing behind you, then you really cannot approach in a real way the sowing of seeds that are going to produce fruit. You have to cut it out of the way. So all of these ideologies that are modern, unrooted ideologies in the good truth need to be cut down. And if you were going to clear that out of the way, it's not enough simply to cut it down. You actually have to dig down and unroot it. You need help to do that. It's truly beyond the means of human labor to accomplish it. You're going to need a brace of horses to haul that out, or a modern tractor. Once you get down and dig and cut all the roots out, you still need something else to come along and tear it out of the ground for you. I mean, hypothetically, you work at it for years, you might be able to actually get rid of one of those big stumps with your axe and shovel, but it would be a mighty, mighty effort. Now, once you've done that, you still have a lot of work to do, right? Because to cultivate means to actually rip up all of the growth that's there. You need to destroy all of the life that has grown on this patch of land. And that's what you do when you till, you plow, and you aerate the soil. You're destroying all of the root bases of all of the grasses and all of the undergrowth, so that the land is truly devoid of life. Then you can sow the seeds, but only then can you sow the seeds. Are you following? It is a fresh start. That is where the true cultivation begins, is with the fresh start. You cannot approach the Christian truths by coming at it with all of these things and saying, I'm going to hold on to all of these ideas and I'm going to sow some Christian truth in the middle. It's going to die. You need to start fresh. Jesus, when he approached Nicodemus, the teacher in John, he says that the only way into the kingdom of God is to be born again. You have to think about that concept and think about what we're talking about. Being born again, like you're talking about a total fresh start, casting all of your knowledge and understanding away and starting at it with spiritual eyes. Now, of course, there's an important thing here, which is that you can't do it yourself. That's the Christian teaching, right? You actually need to let God do it to you. You actually need to ask him to do it to you, because the clearing of this land is ultimately beyond you. You need a new heart that you can't make. And so you need God to give it to you. You need that barren, fresh, good black soil that he can produce. Any efforts of yours to cut all this stuff down, it's not going to work. You need his help. So when you've asked him for help, then if you've cleaned all of this land and you've come at it like a child, to start fresh and to truly be willing to plant new things that will grow and produce fruit, then you might be ready to actually see a real powerful change in yourself from a life that is cultivated towards godliness and real spirituality. It's a fundamentally different thing from what we like to think of it as, because when you talk about cultivating holiness, when you talk about cultivating mindfulness, when you talk about cultivating mental resiliency, people, they think about it as things they can add to themselves. I like my tree. I'm not getting rid of this tree. It's a good tree. that's fine, but that tree is consuming the life that you need to produce fruit, and in and of itself, it's tall. You might be able to cut it down and build something from it, but it can't feed you, man. If your life has not produced food that is satisfying to you, cut the garbage down and start fresh with those seeds that are given to you from God, right? Those Christian truths that can actually grow and produce food for you. That's what you need, man. And so I challenge you to really think when you're talking about cultivating. You can't do this by meditation and the threefold path or the eightfold path or some tantric exercise incorporated into your life. It is truly only achieved through an act of total surrender, of acknowledging one's own foolishness and need for outside help, and then being willing to let your heart be wiped clean so that you can start like a baby and grow properly for the first time. I'll show you another image that might help to illuminate what I'm talking about. All right, so here's the image I'd like you to see. There is this little blueberry bush here. Now, that blueberry bush should look a lot like those ones over there. You see them? All their foliage and blossoms on them. But unfortunately, he didn't look like that. He looked like a long stick with a couple of little branches on top that was producing no fruit. All that growth that had gone on before to go way up here till he was 5 foot tall, it basically produced nothing. It was useless growth. It was real growth, and it had the appearance of life, but it wasn't producing anything at all of any value. So then I had to prune it. And you see here that I cut this bush off and cut her like about 8 inches from the ground. And now there is this new life coming out of it. Do you see that? And if you look at it, you can see that there's new shoots coming off, and there's little buds all over the stick that are going to make branches that are going to come out, and it will turn into a proper bush that can actually produce life. Now, I hope that you can see the analogy here, that it may seem difficult to ask that you cut off all that you have previously added to yourself and say, these philosophies which are not helping you, you need to get rid of them and just start fresh and look at it from a new perspective. But that's what you need to do. You need to cut it off. It has not produced fruit. It has left you in despair. And if you're here, it's because you're actually looking for some kind of meaning. But this is what it takes. It takes an actual cutting back and a starting over to let that new growth come that only comes through Christ, through a real relationship with God through Christ. That, if you can truly bring yourself to the place of humility that you need something new, that's what it is. You need to start over, and you need to let these little shoots come out that will start in a few years to actually produce real fruit. So that's my message for today, and I hope that it communicated something that might really challenge you, that this journey of spirituality and mindfulness and mental resiliency, it's not an adding to yourself of things. It is truly a changing of yourself and a complete and utter renewal that is required for this to happen in a meaningful way. So now I'm Neil Whitman signing off, and I say Godspeed to you all.